Zoo. Mariana Śligielska is a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. She received her PhD in comparative gender studies at the Central European University in Budapest. Mariana's doctoral project examined how the concepts of nature, animality, and humanness have been and continue to be constructed in relation to sexuality, gender, and race through the establishment of modern zoological gardens. At the Max Planck Institute, she is a member of the Body of Animals Working Group in Department 3, Artifacts, Knowledge, Action. She has published on zoos and gender, scientific research on hormones, relations between affect, transgender, and animal sex.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me well? So I'm going to speak in English because my German really sucks, so bear with me. If anything is unclear or I go too fast, give me some kind of visible sign so I can slow down and also explain something more. So thank you for having me here. Thank you for the group and everyone who organized this lecture. So I will start here in Berlin and talk about an event called Gay Night at the Zoo. Perhaps some of you have heard about it or even attended it. It's advertised as an open-air swing party organized at the Berlin Zoo. It's hosting lectures, concerts, performances, and DJs for more than 1,000 guests. The party started in 2006 and at first was taking place during the Pride Week. It's one of the largest LGBT-themed events organized in collaboration with the city zoo. According to the official communication, the goal of this gay party at the zoo is to celebrate diversity, cosmopolitanism, and tolerance. This charity event also funds school tours to the zoo, and in the spirit of the zoo's educational mission, the organizers recommend that pupils visit the penguin house in particular, because same-sex pairing in this species is very common. Representations of these tuxedo-wearing penguins are ever present in the event's promotional materials. As you can see, this is a map of the event. Oh, thank you. And this particular species is casted as especially significant for the construction of the queer zoo animals phenomenon that I will discuss today. But Berlin Zoo is not alone in organizing this kind of events, focusing on sexuality and sex in the animal kingdom. So they are especially common around Valentine's Day. And Los Angeles Zoo invites their adult visitors to an event named Sex and the City Zoo. This R-rated zoo tour focuses on courtship rituals and other sexual behaviors of wild animals and culminates with a candlelight dinner at the zoo. Many other zoos across the US especially offer similar adult-only sex tours. The Michigan Zoo brands their tour Wild at Heart. The New York City Central Park Zoo calls it Jungle Love. Then the Bois Zoo in Idaho invites their visitors to Wild Love at the zoo. San Francisco has Woo at the Zoo. And the Binder Park Zoo offers a peek to its Zoorotica. These are just some examples. The last 3 or even 4 decades saw major transformations in global sexuality politics. With the birth of the modern LGBT rights movement, legal rights directly affecting many people in the community have been changing worldwide, and of course to a varying degree, with decriminalization of homosexuality, introduction of anti-discrimination legislation, access to gender confirmation surgery, laws concerning military service, blood donation, same-sex marriage, adoption rights, and others. And along with these changes, the phenomenon of homosexuality in the animal kingdom gained traction within widely recognized biological and ethological research. So here I would like to mention some pioneering works of biologists such as Bruce Bagamill and his Biological Exuberance, evolutionary biologist John Ravgarden, who wrote Evolution's Rainbow, also evolutionary ecologist Aldo Poiani, the author of Animal Homosexuality, primatologist and ethologist Frans de Waal, who studies sexual behavior in bonobos. A lot of that is studied in captivity in zoos. And last but not least, a primatologist and anthropologist, Volker Sommer, who will be giving a lecture in this series later in the semester. These are some of his books. Also recently, popular science writing on this topic has increased, so this is one of the titles I found just very recently in French. This proliferation of literature prompted many zoos and animal parks to offer sex tours that focus specifically on non-normative animal behavior. These gay zoo tours usually accompany other large-scale LGBT events. For example, the Artis Royal Zoo in Amsterdam started their Homosexuality in the Animal Kingdom tour already in 1998 during the 5th International Gay Games, which is the largest sporting events for the LGBT community. Hosted by the oldest zoo in the Netherlands, this special tour was initiated by its director, Martin Frankenhuis, a veterinary surgeon with an interest in animal sexuality. Since then, Artis offers the guided tour annually during the Gay Pride in Amsterdam, and similar tours have been held in other zoos. These gay zoo tours and night parties seem to offer much more than just fun pastime activity. Some local authorities are eager to build their city's reputation as open, liberal, and tolerant places. Officially welcoming these events underscores their corporate social responsibility. And the zoo, as a venue for this, is not such a surprise. Since its birth in the late 18th century, the public zoo helped to showcase development, openness, and innovation of the modern metropolis. To put it simply, having a public zoological garden would instantly boost the status and prestige of the city, and I'm talking here about 19th century around. In this way, the zoo also allows for performing certain types of modern subjectivities, in particular middle-class, national, and urban ones. Given the history of the zoo as one intimately inscribed into the modern citizenship project, gay zoo tours and parties offer insight into an important modification of sexual citizenship and modern subjectivities. They can be interpreted as cases of institutional harnessing of popular interest in animal sex. However, they also raise some questions, like, doesn't the zoological context run the risk of animalizing homosexuals? That said, it's important to ask also who can afford seeking affinity with the non-humans in shaping their sexual ability, subjectivity. What is the gain for the LGBT community for proving same-sex pairing in non-human animals? And the key answer to these questions lies in the ambiguous and extremely powerful category of naturalness. The discourse of nature often served as a double-edged argument against queers. On the one hand, non-heteronormative behaviors are often labeled as unnatural, aberrant, or simply called crimes against nature. On the other hand, sometimes nature tends to be opposed to culture as brute and uncivilized. So reclaiming nature for queer politics is a powerful move, but never an innocent one. In today's talk, I will try to grapple with this dilemma, and I will do this by showing what role do queer zoo animals play in the story of making sexuality natural again. However, before we dive into this topic, I will first guide you through a brief history of the institution of the Zoological Garden. And this will not be a comprehensive history of the zoo, but rather one specifically focused on how gender and sexuality are inscribed into the space. Here I want to highlight those moments when what I call sex discourse manifests itself in the zoo. And by sex discourse, I don't only mean the Valentine's Day or gay special tours I just mentioned. For me, it means looking both at the reproduction of species as part of the nature conservation efforts and the reproduction of social orders manifested through biological narratives, space design, and species classifications. In the second part of the talk, I will move on to discussing two cases of queer zoo animals, a term I am consciously and playfully using here to flesh out the tissue of political discourses on sex and species. All right, so what and who are these creatures that stir debates on naturalness of sexuality and gender? How does the zoo mediate non-human queerness? I will try to show how the representations of queer animals are produced, in what ways they challenge heterosexuality and gender binary as the norm in the natural world. And my main argument here is that non-human animals play a crucial role in defining boundaries of human understandings of sexuality and gender. In this way, looking at the human-animal relations might allow for broadening queerness as an analytical perspective. To be more specific, I investigate the negotiations between the biological and cultural aspects of gender and sexuality at the site of the zoo. You might ask why zoo matters in that context at all. Well, first of all, this peculiar venue with over 3-century-long tradition of combining science with entertainment and public education seems important. According to WAZA, the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, over 700 million visitors worldwide pass through the gates of zoos and aquariums every year. And to scale it down a bit, in 2018 alone, 3.5 million people visited the Berlin Zoo, and the combined number of visitors to Tiergarten, the aquarium and Tierpark was over 5 million. Moreover, WAZA asserts that most zoo visitors are women, mostly mothers, and zoos are often presented as one of the top places for family-oriented leisure. These numbers alone show that it's crucial to carefully analyze the gender aspects of such popular and powerful sites that serve as one of the primary ways people encounter wild animals and experience nature. So let's move on to sketching this history of the zoo. People have been collecting live animals for display purposes for centuries, live and dead animals. The driving force for creating the first animal collections is usually attributed to the virtues of wonder and curiosity. In the Renaissance, royalty, noblemen, and clergy often collected natural specimens in cabinets of curiosity, also known as Kunstkammer or Wunderkammer. These private collections were usually located in a single room filled from floor to ceiling with the most unexpected objects. Yeah. Corals, shells, coins, stuffed animals, books, rocks, minerals, impaled butterflies, insects, fossils, skulls, eggs, horns, dried plants, skeletons, and other naturalia. So this engraving from the 16th century is one of the earliest illustrations of the layout of such collection. This particular cabinet of curiosity belonged to Ferrante Imperato, an Italian pharmacist. The animal specimens in the natural history collections are all dead. I mean, there are some very weird dog-looking creatures on the floor, but who knows what they are. They might be fantastic. Collecting living animals was much more challenging, and it was limited usually to royalty and prominent aristocracy because keeping live exotic animals required substantial resources and wealth. Living creatures in menageries supplemented the cabinets of curiosities in the task of demonstrating the wealth and prestige of their owners. And this is why the Renaissance menageries are often focused on collecting fabulous, marvelous, and rare specimens. So lions, tigers, elephants, bears, and other ferocious beasts served as tokens of power and status. By the late 18th century, natural history, as a branch of knowledge focused on natural objects and organisms, was gaining popularity. That was partly owed to the fact that European colonization was reaching further lands, and more exotic species captured in the wild were also transported to European menageries. The major change brought by this development was that private collection started to get institutionalized into public zoological gardens. So first, in 1779, the Imperial Tiergarten Schönbrunn, located near Vienna, opened its premises to the public. Later, in 1792, soon after the beginning of the French Revolution, animals from the Versailles Menagerie were transferred to the Museum of Natural History in Jardin des Plantes in Paris. That's de Versailles. This trend in institutionalizing menageries started to spread across Europe, and new animal parks started to open. The London Zoological Gardens in 1828, Amsterdam Artis in 1838, Antwerp in 1843, and the Berlin Tiergarten in 1844. It's important to note that the first public zoos belonged to the modern urban infrastructure that helped to assert the prestige of the city, as I already mentioned before. Those institutions grew into the spatial and social tissue of the modernizing city. So whereas menageries were usually located in the outskirts of the cities, the modern zoo was a strictly urban phenomenon. Let's take into account a few key factors that shaped the modern city at the turn of the 20th century. Industrialization, colonialism, capitalism, and the rise of the middle class. Industrial revolution drastically transformed the urban landscape, and the chain of transformation in the spatial and social dimension of the city was unprecedented. Population rates grew rapidly due to migration from rural areas to the cities. Intense intercontinental migration changed the ethnic and racial compositions of the population in both Europe and North America. And for the first time, one could experience the phenomenon which we are probably quite accustomed to already, urban crowds. Cities expanded spatially following clear patterns in urban development. So centers bursting at their seams with the influx of the impoverished working class, while the bourgeoisie moved to the new residential areas. And apart from these spatial changes, traditional family structures were challenged by the rise of capitalist economy, individualization in the society, and the entrance of more prominent entrance of women into the workforce. In the heart of the colonial empires, these interlinked processes of modernization activated social anxieties around the seemingly degenerative and corruptive character of the newly transformed urban space. Environmental pollution of the industrial metropolis came to be quite literally attached to the influx of migrants. Their poor living conditions started to be seen as a source of diseases, and the newcomers were blamed for moral decline. Rapidly changing modern cities started to be associated with deviancy. This perceived proliferation of deviancy can be pinned down to a number of social and environmental factors tied together and seen as threatening to the white heterosexual European masculinity. And same-sex behavior was believed to be caused by strictly urban phenomena such as overpopulation, contact with corruptive migrants, different diets, as well as environmental factors such as toxicity, pollution, and contamination. Same-sex desire was not yet defined as homosexuality by medicine and psychiatry at that time that we're talking about. In the early 19th century, the nascent sexual degeneration theory attributed the so-called sexual inversion to external rather than internal factors. We can see this diagnosis as a response to extreme demographic upheavals and the changing environment of the human habitat. It's important to note that especially port cities saw an increased visibility of homosexual communities. At the same time, harbor and port cities were among the first to host zoological gardens because of easy access to wild animals. Traffic in exotic species initially developed out of the colonial commerce as a surplus commodity. It soon grew into an increasingly prominent branch of commerce known as animal trade. In this sense, the history of zoological gardens and collections is materially and symbolically interlaced with the history of colonialism. Control of and domination over colonial territories shaped the zoological exhibits and the way in which they represented non-human animals as colonial and exotic others. So for architecture at the time, it wasn't uncommon to put exotic animals in buildings that resembled temples or other places of worship that would kind of refer to the place, culture of the place where the animals came from, which is an orientalizing and exoticizing move. Animal exhibits became displays of colonial reach, and zoos themselves served as a prime symbols of civic and national pride. As public institutions, they were designed to enhance cosmopolitan character of the city and provide properly catered contact with nature. A contact that, with its therapeutic value, would relieve the urban publics from the threats of degeneration. Catching up with the accumulated changes while conquering the other parts of the world, the bourgeoisie invested in an even more romanticized idea of nature, one that provided a flawless sanctuary to their moral ideals. Natural spaces such as parks and zoological gardens provided solace, peace, and promised moral uplift. In contrast to the emergent discourses of urban perversion, wilderness and nature have been reinvented as healthy alternative to the artificiality of the city and the vices it produced. So this is a photo, I don't know if it's visible, from the London Zoo. As urban historian Patrick Wirtz puts it, nature was brought into the city to tame the jungle the city has become. This kind of moral regulation was inscribed into the landscape design of the zoo. Initially, the zoo was developed as an elitist space for strictly regulated contact with wild fauna, often steered by scientific principles, especially in the case of the London Zoo. As public venues, these spaces of scientifically approved encounters with wilderness fostered specific kinds of relationship towards non-human nature. Seen as the pinnacle of modern urban culture, the 19th century zoo also allowed for a public display of middle-class respectability. The gardens became a fashionable place to observe exotic animals, but also to be yourself observed by other visitors. In this sense, they cultivated particular kinds of desires. As Kate Sandilands and Bruce Erickson show in their Introduction to Queer Ecology's book, public green areas were adjusted to visible heterosexual courtship rituals as part of the deployment of wilderness for a healthy and morally uplifting regulation and recreation. The exotic allure of the zoo made its premises suitable for human romance. As places for the promotion of moral and physical fitness for the citizenry, European and American zoos were equipped with venues for displaying middle-class respectability and wealth, like restaurants, music pavilions, and picturesque pubs. So casual strolling alongside the wide-open promenades was a typical activity in the zoo. The space also allowed for getting lost in the myriad of romantic alleys with small bridges, perfect sites for stealing a kiss, all in the public eye, sanctioning any behavior considered inappropriate. The space of the zoo was constructed according to a pastoral ideal of nature, a space for recreation and admiration. In other words, the zoo was heterosexual, white, and middle class in design. This rendered any queer expression in human or non-human animals invisible or made undesirable as aberrant or unnatural. Okay, so far I have focused mostly on landscape design and on how zoos, the space of the zoo is accommodated specifically gendered and sexual ideals of the bourgeoisie. But you probably wonder, what about the animals? So early zoos typically displayed animals according to a systematic order from lower to higher organisms, each species in separate cage. This arrangement of animal bodies under the scientific eye reflected the evolutionary progress narrative. In the mid-19th century, the Linnean system of botanical classifications became the yardstick for spatial arrangement of animal collections. So from Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist. The great chain of being, or scala naturae, became the dominant visual metaphor for this and other classificatory systems, rearranging the space of the collection according to taxa, classes, and species belonging. Natural curiosities like two-headed sheep or albino ravens, so popular in cabinets of curiosities, were replaced by singular specimens typical for a given species or class of animals. Most importantly, this reorganization of collections according to the Linnean system entailed positioning sexual reproduction as the paradigm for natural creation. The aesthetics of the collection relied on sexuality in a material way. With a later shift to more naturalistic display design, animals were often arranged in formations that resembled reproductive units, so a male, a female of a given species, oftentimes, sometimes accompanied by their offspring. Actually, not that often, because usually they didn't really reproduce in the captivity so well. These zoological nuclear family portraits served as instructive scenes of heteronormativity, making heterosexuality based on gender binary the norm for the animal world and defining what is natural for the survival of the species. However, it's important to notice that these representations entail disciplining animal bodies and displaying them in a way that reflects desired qualities, desired by humans. For example, by highlighting fidelity in bird coupling, parental care, or male domination in some species. This allows for treating non-human animals as powerful models for human behavior, models for morality, politics, and identities. But what about queer animals that I promised to talk about? If you search for the term queer animals in relation to zoos, it's actually not so unusual to find historical accounts dating back to the 19th century. So, you don't have to read it, this is just an example, so don't read it. In 1884, the Baltimore Sun reported on queer animals from Swan Island that arrived on board a boat from the Caribbean. In 1890, a pair of queer animals of the deep was exhibited in a wooden tank in Washington. These sea creatures, known as manatees or sea cows, were the first one to survive more than a week after being captured, and thus could be displayed to curious crowds gathering to see a rare beast that seems to combine the qualities of the seal, the whale, and the land cow. Other historical accounts of queer animals from the turn of the 20th century vary from news on new shipments of live specimens gathered for natural history museums during colonial scientific expeditions, to depictions of wondrous creatures from distant lands whose looks or behaviors amused human viewers. But a closer examination of these archival records reveals that in the late 19th and early 20th century, the word queer was used to describe the strange, mysterious, or peculiar characteristics of exotic creatures. Queer in this context means as much as out of the usual, weird, other. In the Anglophone context, the connotation of the word queer with same-sex sexual behavior and what we would now call gender non-conforming identities came about in the early 20th century. Initially, the term queer was used as a neutral term employed by men having sex with men, and it was only later that it gained the pejorative meaning associated with deviance and degeneration. Further reclamation of queerness, the one that you're probably more familiar with right now, as a marker of anti-assimilationist politics had to wait until the end of the 20th century. So we have to kind of remember about this temporality when we talk about queer animals and when we talk about them. But then you might ask, what is exactly the relation between exhibiting the strange, the weird queer animals and sexuality? So non-reproductive sexuality among animals was an unspoken referent until it became part of the naturalistic evidence for early sexological and criminological classifications in the 19th century. Animal husbandry and livestock management handbooks structured early studies of animal sexual behavior with a strong focus on breeding for obvious economic reasons. From early etological studies, same-sex sexual behavior among non-human animals was deemed pathological, both as non-reproductive and unnatural. What I want to highlight here is that the notion of sexual abnormalities in the animal kingdom as a result of captivity became a scientific keystone for later claims for pathologizing homosexual behavior among humans. In this way, the zoo was implicated as an important reference to human sexuality formation. First, sexologists based their research on studies of people in various forms of captivity: prisoners, patients of asylums, students in boarding schools. For example, the Italian father of criminology, Cesare Lombroso, categorized sexual inversion as a crime resulting from reversion to a savage state, a term containing both animalistic and racial undertones. In his study, Lombroso lists unnatural vices in horses, donkeys, cattle, insects, fowl, dogs, ants, and primitive societies. This was supposed to serve as an evidence for the hereditary and degenerative character of same-sex sexual behavior, both in humans and animals. The usage of animal example in this way is linked to a hypothesis on sexual inversion resulting from limited access to sexual partners in captivity. So the records of queer animals understood as bizarre peculiarities might not prove to be the most helpful in delineating the origins of contemporary fascination with non-normative sexual behavior in animals. Nevertheless, they should be still regarded as an important genealogical trope in the shifting histories of how zoo cases of homosexual, gay, or queer animals surfaced in public discourse in recent years. After all, the joint production of early taxonomic divisions, the emergence of the category of species, colonialist explorations in search of natural wonders and resources, and the scientific gaze of naturalists and first zoogoers were all fueled by the allure of the uncanny beasts that seem to exist outside of the norm. Those that could not be identified or classified so easily, that is to say, those that could not fit in any known category, those with eerie looks, strange anatomy, rare status, or extraordinary behavior, those were the queer animals exhibited at the turn of the 20th century. But what about more recent cases of queer animals? As you could see from the start of this talk, one species gained an almost iconic status when it comes to homosexual animals. And of course, I'm talking about the penguins. In 2016, a pair of male penguins named Stan and Ollie were moved from the Berlin Zoo to Tierpark Hagenbeck near Hamburg. International media outlets reported very passionately on this small transfer. The penguins were moved for a specific reason. They were being removed from the penguin breeding project, part of the European Endangered Species Program, because they strayed from reproductive behavior. And newspaper headlines blew up with titles like, "Gay penguins left in peace after breeding plans stall," or "2 gay penguins are being moved to Hamburg so that they can stay together." Zookeepers wanted these penguins to see these penguins breed with females, but they only had eyes for each other. And many, many more of this style. And this was not the first time a same-sex penguin couple attracted significant media attention in Germany. So in 2005 already in Bremerhaven Zoo, the zoo came under attack by gay rights activists after announcing their plans to import 4 female Humboldt penguins from Sweden to encourage breeding by their 6 males, which were discovered to be same-sex pairs. The outraged local gay community accused the zoo of interfering with the animals' natural behavior by bringing in the Swedish temptresses with a mission to seduce gay penguins and turn them straight. After failed attempts to actually break up the homosexual penguin couples, the zoo shifted their policy towards those non-reproductive individuals. The male penguins were reportedly observed trying to hatch rocks, and in 2009, the zoo supported this parenting behavior. 2 male penguins, Z and Philpunkt, if I pronounce it correctly, were given an egg that was rejected by its biological parents, and in result, they managed to successfully rear a chick. In this turn of the events, the zoo and media portrayed the penguins as happy foster family and parents, proud fathers absolutely accepted by the rest of the penguins. In an official statement, the zoo claimed that, and I quote here, "Since the chick arrived, they have been behaving just as you would expect a heterosexual couple do." With reported cases of penguins' homosexual bonding in zoos across the globe, from Germany, Canada, Japan, the US, China, United Kingdom, Israel, and many others, these wobbling celebrities can now get married and even adopt eggs to hatch in several zoos and aquariums. Given the proliferation of the gay penguin stories, it seems like the adorable tuxedo-wearing birds also became a flagship species for gay rights. But ironically, around the same time when the penguins became an iconic for various LGBT and queer movements, the same animal was endorsed as a symbol of traditional family values by right-wing fundamentalist Christians in the US. This was after the commercial success of the 2005 wildlife documentary March of the Penguins, featuring the majestic emperor penguins in their heroic efforts to reproduce and survive in the harsh conditions of the Antarctic. So now I want to play a short trailer to the film. Oh, it works.
Stop, you don't see it.
Up.
Because you have to close that.
So we have to go.
Yeah.
So let's close it. And then go here. Okay.
Yeah.
There is a mysterious ritual that dates back thousands of years. No living creature has survived except the penguin. They have wings, but cannot fly. They are birds that think they're fish.
Probably we will longer than 10 past or 15 past. It's okay?
They embark on a nearly impossible journey to find a mate. For 20 days and 20 nights, the emperor penguin will march to a place so extreme it supports no other life. In the harshest place on earth, love finds a way. This is the incredible true story of a family's journey to bring life into the world. March.
Of the penguins, yeah. All right. We're back again. Adorable, right? This characteristic voiceover by Morgan Freeman is an essential part of the huge commercial success of the French award-winning wildlife documentary. American release by National Geographic Feature Films and Warner Independent Pictures was especially well received by right-wing Christian evangelicals who welcomed this family entertainment as positively illustrating traditional family values such as monogamy, child-rearing, sacrifice, and even as corresponding with the intelligent design theory. The mobilization of conservative viewers around this film was really unprecedented. The film portrays a heroic journey of the penguins to lay and hatch their eggs in spite of the severe weather conditions of the Antarctic winter. It's a story of survival, resilience, and sacrifice. And as such, it cements the reproductive drive as the most natural, almost divine, biological mechanism. But at the same time, it naturalizes human forms of social organization, such as the family unit and the monogamous heterosexual couple. Penguins seems to be perfectly suited for this kind of story, because a breeding pair usually produces one egg, and this small unit presents an uncanny similarity to the 2+1 nuclear family model. But around the same time, when the March of the Penguins was being celebrated by the Christian right in the US, another penguin phenomenon surfaced in public discourse. This one could potentially sabotage the perfect family picture featured in the film. After same-sex penguin couples were observed and brought to the public attention in several zoos across the world, a children's book titled "And Tango Makes Three" was published in 2005 in an aura of controversy. This is the cover. So it's based on a true story of two male chinstrap penguins hatching an orphaned eggs and raising the chick together at the Central Park Zoo in New York City. The book caused huge controversy. According to the American Library Association, And Tango Makes Three was the top most challenged book for the 2000s from 2006 to 2010. Many have perceived this book as a gay propaganda, It was removed or restricted from school curricula and library bookshelves, and massive conservative outrage over a children's story about penguin foster fathers, which does not even mention the word gay, might have been a pointless indignation. Why? Because this story paints a mirror image of a nuclear family they endorse, with the only exception being two dads instead of dad and mom. Ironically, both conservative and liberal discourses share a strong insistence on monogamous marriage and male agency in child-rearing. The true story behind And Tango Makes Three features Roy and Silo, the two most prominent gay penguin celebrities. Let's take a closer look at it. Mating rituals between these two zoo dwellers were observed already in 1998, but their love story hit headlines when, after almost 6 years of devoted bonding and some attempts at incubating stones taken for eggs, zookeepers decided to entrust them with a fertilized egg to hatch. Once the two penguins formed a proper family, they became the perfect material for another tongue-in-cheek light content news. All at the time when debates on gay marriage and gay adoption rights were raging in the US. So the 2004 New York Times article titled "Love That Dare Not Squeak Its Name" presents the penguins as a devoted couple in a stable monogamous union. And I short quote from the article, "For nearly 6 years now, they have been inseparable. They exhibit what in penguin parlance is called ecstatic behavior. That is, they entwine their necks, they vocalize to each other, they have sex. When offered female companionship, they adamantly refuse it." This portrayal of animal sexuality parallels a common narrative employed by the equal marriage movement in the US by major advocacy groups. Namely, building their narratives around an idealized same-sex couple deserving the right to marry. The defining features of a deserving same-sex couple are being in love, forming a devoted long-term relationship, and striving for a family. So the penguins seem to have it all. Once Roy and Silo resisted the temptations of heterosexual courtship, proved to be faithful to each other, and acted as good fathers for their adopted child, Tango, they were cast as models for human gay identity politics. And yet, this penguin drama continued with more twists and turns. As the New York Times reported in 2004, Silo's eye began to wander, and he forsook his partner of 6 years at the Central Park Zoo and took up with a female from California named Scrappy. This sudden breakup led Focus on the Family, an ultra-conservative organization advocating conversion therapy, to embrace Silo as an ex-gay penguin. In the meantime, his daughter Tango was observed to pair up with another female named Tanuzi. Although this soap opera of world of seduction and intrigue set in the zoo kept the public electrified for a time, its coverage and interpretations open up many questions. What exactly makes a penguin gay? Can same-sex sexual behavior in the penguin world serve as a proof for an innate character and naturalness of homosexuality in general? Or rather, does Tango's, the daughter's behavior evidence the learned and transmittable character of same-sex coupling in penguins? Can these observations be further extrapolated to other animals? And what if Silo was actually bisexual and not gay all the time? More generally, what are the consequences of drawing conclusions on sexuality from non-human animals? Roy and Silo were neither the first nor the last same-sex penguin couple observed in captivity. Same-sex bonding in this species has been reported from the beginnings of zoological penguin keeping in the 19th century. And it's very important to add here that penguin species are not sexually dimorphic. That means that the two sexes of the same species exhibit the same secondary sex characteristics. Usually in the zoo, DNA testing from feather, blood, or egg membrane samples is needed to confirm the sex of the penguin. In other words, just by looking at a paired penguins, you cannot tell whether they are same-sex or opposite-sex couple. Susan Talbert and Claudia Matus have analyzed the abundant media discourse on gay penguins in China, Germany, and the US, and found clear patterns in the way these narratives have been constructed. Their analysis of the gay penguin discursive chain shows a strong focus on individual freedoms and minority rights within mainstream identity politics. Generally speaking, it seems like the necessary factors for creating a real gay penguin story is having two male birds exhibiting a strong reproductive drive. The discourses on gay penguins in zoos necessarily describe them as striving to become parents, this hatching eggs, trying to hatch rocks instead of eggs, and all of that. This ascribes a strong reproductive drive to queer non-humans, a trait that conveniently counterbalances the arguments on homosexuality as an evolutionary dead end. However, the way these narratives follow a very familiar pattern of traditional marriage and nuclear family can be further identified as a homonormative approach. So, homonormativity, as defined by Lisa Dugan, is a politic that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them while promising the possibility of a demobilized gay constituency and a privatized, depoliticized gay culture anchored in domesticity and consumption. So it's also very neoliberal. Following this definition, gay penguins become intelligible as a public phenomenon so long as they follow familiar heteronormative patterns of romantic love, monogamous partnership, and culminate in a 2+1 family unit. So another iconic species I want to talk about also seems to be all about family. But at first, you might be surprised that I include this species at all within the category of queer zoo animals, but bear with me. I will talk about the giant panda. There is no presentation about zoos without a panda. They are the unquestioned celebrities of the zoo world. And you probably couldn't miss the recent arrival of two giant pandas to Berlin. So Monk Monk, or Sweet Dream, and Jiao Qing, Darling, quickly became the main attraction of the Berlin Zoo. 10,000 visitors visited the panda exhibit on its opening day. So one day, 10,000 people, a lot. The birds have been transported to Berlin from Chengdu breeding station in China via a special aircraft. On the 23rd of June 2017, the precious pandas arrived at the Schönefeld airport and were greeted by the mayor of Berlin and the ambassador of China. On the 5th of July 2017, Chancellor Angela Merkel and Chinese President Xi Jinping, who came to Germany to attend the G20 summit in Hamburg, inaugurated the opening of the Panda Garden facility. The zoo invested 9 million euros to build a special enclosure for the bears. These official events with VIPs are part of the so-called panda diplomacy, revealing high political stakes in this particular zoo exhibit. The cute bears with their cuddly names and friendly names and cuddly appearance serve as perfect ambassadors. So the practice of using giant pandas as tools for diplomacy has a very long history in China, dating back to the 7th century, when the Empress Wu Zetian sent a pair of these rare animals to the Japanese emperor. The term panda diplomacy was coined during the Cold War, when the People's Republic of China started offering pandas as diplomatic gifts to strategically selected countries as part of their foreign policy plan. Around the 1930s, all giant pandas legally became the property of the Chinese state, and that is the case until today. When in the 1986, the giant panda was put on the red list of threatened species by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, their value as rare animals increased. In 1996, with the implementation of the ban on import and export of endangered species for commercial purposes, under CITES, or the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species and Wild Fauna and Flora, also known as the Washington Convention, China started to loan giant pandas to foreign zoos. In consultation with the government of China, CITES issued a special notification on the giant panda loans, where any export of the animal is only allowed if it generates positive conservation benefits for the species. In result, breeding programs are represented as the key aspects of the giant pandas' conservation and stand for the major reason for their global travels until today. Monk Monk and Jiao Qing are loaned to the Berlin Zoo for 15 years. The zoo will pay 890,000 euros to Beijing every year to host the births. This money is invested in the Chinese government's research program on panda conservation and breeding. Therefore, breeding is also the main purpose of panda residency in Berlin Zoo. Meng and Jiaqing have been carefully selected at the Chengdu research base of giant panda breeding to fulfill this reproductive mission. They form what is known in this world a breeding couple or a breeding pair. This means that they are both genetically suitable and sexually mature to become parents. However, pandas are well known for their extremely low fecundity. They are even believed to be somewhat asexual. Breeding them in captivity proves especially difficult. Females have only one reproductive cycle per year. That is the only time they are fertile, and it lasts for a short period of 24 to 72 hours. So 1 or 2 days in the whole year. In the wild, pandas are solitary animals. They don't meet that often at all. That has been considered in the design of the zoo enclosure in Berlin. The panda garden consists of 2 separated spaces, each 1,080 square meters large, and each inhabited by one of the pandas. The bears can only meet through windows between their enclosures to get to know each other, and these windows, allowing for brief, intimate encounters, are an infrastructural representation of the narrow breeding window that the species has. It's also kind of seen as a part of building like the panda romance, that they don't really see each other that often, but they can smell each other a little bit. And when they're actually entering the estrus, so the reproductive stage, they are supposed to change their voice and things like that. But what else is inscribed into the exhibit? Well, in order to create a perfect conditions for heterosexual romance to flourish, one needs to highlight the masculine and feminine characteristics of the lovers. So, especially when the species you're dealing with has no visible sex characteristics. That is clarified to the visitors on information plaques on how to tell the bears apart. So Meng, the 5-year-old female panda is described as, and I'm quoting, having a round face, short nose, a loving personality, behaves like a big sister, knows how to sell, likes to be photographed, likes to pose in front of the camera. The 8-year-old male is believed to be an extroverted, lively, sometimes irritated, but likes sports and is very naughty. So, as you can easily see, these descriptions are anthropomorphized and highly gendered. Panda girl likes to pose in front of the camera, while the panda boy likes sports. Again, just like in the case of penguins, giant pandas have very low sexual dimorphism, so it's difficult to determine their sex of young pandas without testing from blood samples. They usually vary in size, but their external genitalia, so the organs typically recognized as biological markers for sexual difference, appear very similar regardless of sex. This imposed gender differentiation is a necessary element of building a credible story of heterosexual romance between 2 non-human animals so similar in appearance and behavior that their sex can only be determined in scientific laboratory. But the lab is also a crucial necessary site for panda captive breeding, because natural conception is a very rare occurrence. The Berlin Zoo has been working closely with the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research to analyze Meng's urine samples. Her hormone levels are closely monitored in the springtime to establish when she enters into the estrus period, the fertile period. And another crucial part of the panda garden is the fertility clinic, with all the necessary reproductive equipment. After failed attempts at natural conception, Meng has been artificially inseminated earlier this month. An ultrasound scheduled for June this year will reveal the results of the procedure. So, the unwavering efforts to breed pandas and induce their sexual vigor result in a parodied version of heterosexual desire, and I uncovered a heavy stitching holding together the romantic love story of the not so natural environment of the zoo. Some zoos resorted to panda porn and decided to show videos of other pandas mating to the lethargic birds. Others tried to use equivalent of Viagra to stimulate the bears. These actions and reproductive failures not only exposed some sort of queerness of these non-human animals framed as ambassadors of wildlife protection, but also to a certain extent queer the humans who intervene in pandas' sexual lives as well as those observing it. Pandas are being paired, gendered, and made heterosexual despite their lack of interest in breeding. What I want to highlight here is not only the human desire to see pandas reproducing, but also its mediation via biotechnological tools. This makes this reproduction a highly controlled one. And reproduction plays, maybe this is too distracting, maybe. Reproduction plays a crucial role in contemporary zoological gardens. Until the 20th centuries, zoos depended on animal collecting expeditions to supply them with specimens. Before the advancements in veterinary care and the development of wildlife husbandry, the death rates in menageries and zoos were extremely high. Even if the animals made it through the hazardous travels from their places of capture, it was likely that diseases, infections, parasites, lack of proper diet, and low rates of acclimatization would drastically decimate surviving individuals. Although wild animals would sometimes reproduce in zoos, systematically managed breeding in captivity was not an immediate concern for zoos until the late 20th century. And why was that? Because with the beginnings of the environmental movement and the introduction of international laws restricting wildlife trade or actually prohibiting it, zoological gardens accelerated their captive breeding programs to ensure that they had animals to exhibit. Modern zoos employ advanced reproductive technologies like the ones I discussed in the panda case. They manage their populations through internationally coordinated animal reproduction programs. This means that all individuals of one species held in accredited zoos are treated as one population, and reproductive choices focus on ensuring highest genetic diversity within this captive population. So, for example, all giraffes in European accredited zoos are kind of managed and bred as one population, as if they were like a herd. So, let's move on to conclusions. In this talk, I have analyzed the phenomenon of queer zoo animals in close relationship with historical changes that made it possible to openly discuss animal queerness nowadays. Lynn Neihart, a historian of science, notes that from the late 19th century, the primary locus where the biological perspective developed was not the elite realm of the university science, but the civic realm of museums, schools, zoos, and other public enterprises. This is where the publics learn about what belongs to nature and what doesn't. Since then, the biological perspective represented in the zoo shifted towards pressing ecological issues such as the species extinction and climate change. In the epoch of the Anthropocene, biodiversity is crucially linked with sexual diversity, especially when breeding endangered species is concerned. In this sense, it's important to ask, what's the role of zoos in producing sexual natures? How are wider sexual politics impacted by the naturalization of subjectivities accommodated by the zoo? My specific focus on cases of queer zoo animals, prompts questions on how representations and discourses about them function at a political level. Are queer zoo animals simply tokens for human politics? Or are they important actors that interrupt the heteronormative evolutionary template? Given that the zoo produces operational definitions of sexuality and reproduction, perhaps zoo animals should be seen as engineered rather than domesticated or wild creatures. The process of engineering zoo specimens as embodied types of wild species, bred in captivity for generations now, and exhibited in urban environments, facilitates domestication of our wider understandings of sexuality and gender. Animal sexuality is still oftentimes presented in relation to human sexuality and vice versa. It is not a coincidence that the penguin homosexual romance is flourishing when humans fight for marriage equality and adoption rights for LGBT group persons, and that zoos resorts to the latest reproductive technologies to stimulate giant pandas to breed against their own extinction. For the fantasy of nature as a purely transcendent and seductive, it seems easy to root identity categories in a timeless entity offering ontological stability. However, this naturalization entails serious political consequences. So consider this popular meme that proudly announces that homosexuality is found in over 450 species and homophobia only in one. You probably know it. And this meme also started to mutate into new versions with a number of homosexual species steadily increasing. While I'm sure this message confirming the naturalness of homosexuality provides comfort and a sense of stability for many within the queer community, I think that as a political strategy, it locks sexuality into a fixed category of belonging. As such, it flattens the creative possibilities offered by non-normative relationalities developed beyond the constraints of identity politics. I see the attempts at hardwiring sexuality and gender through evidence from the natural as a shortcut in a much more laborious process of deterritorializing identity categories. As I have demonstrated, civic institutions domesticating nature, such as zoos, already specialize in providing natural evidence for heterosexuality. Why to duplicate the same model? Not to mention that evidencing heterosexuality in non-human animals is sometimes more painstaking than it might seem. Pandas. The task is to find a way of including non-humans in queer politics without exploiting them as signifiers for human-imposed categorizations. Therefore, if non-human animals can complicate the ways we tend to think about humanness, gender, sexuality, or even queerness, they are the allies in this new queer project. Thank you.